On July 27, 1982, a Learjet waited for a 25-year-old video game designer named Howard Scott Warshaw at San Jose International Airport. Atari's CEO, Ray Kassar, had called him the day before with an order. Warshaw needed to fly to Burbank immediately to present a game design directly to Steven Spielberg. Atari had just paid between $20 and $25 million to license the rights to build a video game based on E.T., the Extraterrestrial, a film that had grossed more than any movie in industry history at that point. Warshaw was given one instruction that would define everything that followed. The game had to be finished and ready to manufacture by September 1st in order to hit store shelves for Christmas. That gave him 5.5 weeks. 5 years later, Atari would bury hundreds of thousands of unsold copies of that game in a New Mexico landfill, in an operation the company would deny for decades. Every week, we tell the stories of the consoles, studios, and engineering decisions that shaped the video game industry, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. Howard Scott Warshaw was not an inexperienced developer when Atari called him. He had built two of the company's biggest hits in a row. His first major project, Yar's Revenge, took 7 months to design and program, followed by 5 more months of testing. It became Atari's best-selling original game for the 2600, selling more than 1 million copies. His follow-up, an adaptation of Raiders of the Lost Ark, took 10 months and sold another 1 million copies. By the summer of 1982, Warshaw had a reputation inside Atari as the designer who could turn any assignment into a hit. E.T. the Extraterrestrial premiered in June of 1982 and became an immediate cultural phenomenon. Atari's parent company, Warner Communications, entered a bidding war with other studios for the rights to build a video game based on the film. When the deal closed in late July, Atari had secured the license, but had also burned through nearly the entire production calendar in the process of negotiating it. Spielberg had specifically requested Warshaw as the designer. Warshaw accepted the assignment knowing the timeline was far shorter than anything he had worked with before. His previous 2 games had taken 7 and 10 months respectively, with extensive testing periods built in. E.T. would need to be designed, programmed, and tested in 5.5 weeks, with almost no time reserved for correcting problems once the core game was built. The design Warshaw settled on placed the player in control of E.T., navigating a series of connected screens to collect 3 pieces of an interplanetary phone that would allow the character to call home. The concept was ambitious for an Atari 2600 cartridge in 1982. Rather than a single scrolling screen or a fixed arena, Warshaw built an open world of interconnected zones the player could move between freely, an approach that few games on the console had attempted. Reception from players and critics was immediate and negative. The confusing navigation, the unexplained pit mechanic, and the rushed, unpolished feel of the game generated widespread complaints. Returns began arriving at Atari in large numbers. The game that Atari had built its entire holiday strategy around, timed to the biggest film license the company had ever purchased, became one of the most heavily returned products in the company's history. E.T.'s commercial failure did not happen in isolation. It arrived during a period now known as the North American video game crash of 1983, a broader collapse in the console market driven by market oversaturation, a flood of low-quality third-party games across the industry, and declining consumer confidence in video games as a product category. E.T. is frequently cited as a contributing factor to that crash and to Atari's financial losses during 1983 and 1984, though the extent of its individual role in an industry-wide collapse remains debated among historians. What is well documented is that Atari, facing a warehouse full of unsold inventory at its manufacturing plant in El Paso, Texas, needed to dispose of a large volume of unsold cartridges and hardware. In September of 1983, Atari arranged with a landfill in Alamogordo, New Mexico, to dispose of that inventory. Local witnesses at the time described the operation involving multiple truckloads of cartridges, dumped into a specially prepared section of the landfill, crushed and covered with concrete. The New York Times reported on the dumping on September 28, 1983, citing an Atari spokesperson who confirmed that cartridges and computer equipment from the El Paso plant had been discarded at the site. Beyond that initial report, Atari did not publicly discuss the burial again for decades, and later spokespeople for the company said they had no corporate record of the event. In the absence of further confirmation, the story became a piece of gaming folklore, repeated and exaggerated for 30 years. Some versions claim the entire 5 million produced cartridges of E.T. specifically had been buried. The true scale of what went into the ground in Alamogordo remained unverified until 2014. That year, a documentary production team secured permission from the city of Alamogordo to excavate the site, working with local waste contractor Joe Lewandowski, who had witnessed the original dumping decades earlier as a young man. The team located the burial site beneath roughly 30 feet of compacted trash and concrete. On April 26, 2014, in front of a crowd of local residents and gaming journalists, excavators began digging into the site. The dig recovered just over 1,300 cartridges, including copies of E.T., alongside other Atari titles such as Centipede, Warlords, and Asteroids, confirming that the landfill held games beyond E.T. specifically. The city of Alamogordo, which owned the recovered cartridges as the landfill's operator, later auctioned a portion of them on eBay. The full auction generated just under $108,000, including one boxed ET cartridge that sold individually for $1,537, a striking price for a game that had once been considered nearly worthless. Howard Scott Warshaw left Atari not long after ET's release and moved away from the video game industry entirely, eventually becoming a licensed psychotherapist. In interviews conducted decades later, he has spoken openly about the project, describing the 5.5-week deadline as the defining constraint of the game's design and noting that the ambition behind the concept, an open, explorable world built around a licensed film character, was itself unusual for its time, even though the execution suffered under the timeline Atari had imposed. The 2014 excavation did not resolve every detail of what happened in Alamogordo in 1983. The exact number of cartridges buried, and the exact proportion of them that were ET specifically, remains something historians continue to debate, based on incomplete records from a company that never fully documented the event itself. What the excavation did resolve was the central question that had defined the story for 3 decades. The burial was real, it happened largely as the original 1983 newspaper report described, and a rushed video game built in 5.5 weeks became, for a brief period in gaming history, a physical object buried in the New Mexico desert.